Hello, my name is Pablo. I'm a second-year PhD candidate at the Neuromechanical Modeling and Engineering Lab at the University of Twente. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about a muscle model that considers the pennation angle for the muscle and joint stiffness estimation. First of all, let me explain what we understand under joint stiffness. The main function of the neuromusculoskeletal system is movement. Multiple over-actuated degrees of freedom can generate a huge number of motions. But humans do not move in a random way. They move the way they do according to certain criteria. The first of these criteria is efficiency. Humans, and please note that I'm mostly referring to individuals without movement disorders, have optimized energy expenditure, minimizing muscle activations to perform daily activities such as standing or walking. The second criterion, which is more relevant to this work, is stability. One of the main functions of the musculoskeletal system is to remain stable. Otherwise, we will be falling all the time. We achieve movement thanks to the muscles, which are able to contract to generate forces and torques that move the skeleton. But this is not the only thing they do, as muscles and tendons possess elastic properties. This means that when they are stretched, they store elastic energy and generate a force that opposes that stretch. This brings us to our definition of joint stiffness, which is the sum of projected stiffnesses of all elements comprising a certain joint. The main contributors to the joint stiffness are muscles and tendons. Besides providing stability, joint stiffness dictates how humans interact with the environment. Just imagine what happens when you hold a drill to make a hole in the wall. You will co-contract your arm muscles and consequently increase your joint stiffness to avoid that the drill slips off the wall. Due to the relevance of this property, a lot of effort has been put to estimate it, and several communities have attempted to do so. Firstly, we have the system identification community, which is basically a data-driven approach where the parameters of a simple model, typically a second-order model, are identified using experimental data. The main advantages of these methods are that the results are able to explain experimental data and that little or no knowledge about the anatomy of the joint is required. The main limitations of these techniques are that during data collection, the studied joint needs to be perturbed. This may not be feasible for weaker individuals or patients. Additionally, it can be quite hard to interpret results, as most of the times a black box model is used. In other words, it is very challenging to find causal relationships from the results to muscle or joint function. A second community that has attempted to estimate joint stiffness is the so-called quasi-stiffness. Basically, the derivative of a joint torque angle relationship is obtained. It is very simple to compute, but unfortunately it does not capture joint stiffness, since the measured torque also includes activation and velocity-dependent components. And with joint stiffness, we're only looking at the position-dependent components. Biomechanical modeling is an emerging field to estimate joint stiffness. It is a bottom-up approach in which the constituting elements of the joints are modeled. These structures are the muscles, tendons, and bones. The stiffness of each modeled muscle-tendon unit is obtained and projected onto the joint level following this equation. It uses the muscle-tendon unit stiffness, the moment arm, the variation of moment arm with respect to the joint angle, and the muscle-tendon unit force. The main advantage of this methodology are that no external perturbations are required. We can study stiffness at multiple scales, from muscles to tendons to the joint scale, and identify causal relationships between them. And in theory, any kind of movement can be simulated. Some of the disadvantages of this method are that there is the need to validate the results with a gold standard, and that a lot of prior knowledge on anatomy and muscle architecture is required. But what exactly is muscle architecture? Mainly, it can refer to two things. First, we have the hierarchical structure of muscles. From the macro to the micro scale, we find the whole muscle, muscle fibers, myofibers, sarcomeres, myofilaments, etc. And then we have the pennation angle, which is the angle between muscle fibers and tendon, that explains how the force generated by the muscles is projected onto the tendon. This image shows quite some variety of architectures, and it is logical to think that it plays an important role in muscle force and stiffness transmission. In this work, we wanted to develop a stiffness model that can generalize across different pennation angles. Here we show two different models. On the one hand, the previous model, the old model that does not account for the pennation angle when computing the series arrangement of tendon and muscle. In this presentation, we refer to it as Model B. On the other hand, our new model that takes the pennation angle into account when computing equivalent stiffness of a series arrangement. We call this model Model A. The main goal of this work is to present our new joint stiffness model that takes pennation angle into account. We compare it to the older formulation that does not include this feature, and we validate it against the reference joint stiffness values obtained via system identification method. This work brings us one step closer to the development of a single muscle model that can adjust to different pennation angles and contraction conditions. Additionally, our model-based stiffness estimation method does not require external joint perturbation, so it is clinically viable. Now I'm going to talk about the methods. 5 subjects voluntarily participated in this experiment. They were asked to perform a simple movement of ankle, plantar, and dorsiflexion, following a sinusoidal position target displayed on a computer screen, with an amplitude of approximately 10 degrees and a frequency of 0.6 Hz. Regarding the equipment, a dynamometer capable of applying perturbations was used to measure joint torque and angle while the joints were perturbed. The perturbation we used was a pseudo-random binary sequence with an amplitude of 1.5 degrees. EMG signals from 5 lower leg muscles were acquired. A motion capture system was used to track the knee angle. In this video, you can see the experimental setup. The subject is comfortably sitting on a chair while her right ankle is attached to the dynamometer. The screen shows the position target and the current position of the subject. Optical markers and EMG record the kinematics and the activity of the studied muscles, respectively. Small perturbations are being applied to the ankle joint. Now I'm going to briefly describe the EMG-driven musculoskeletal modeling pipeline. It is composed by 5 main blocks. First, we find the muscle-tendon unit, or MTU, activation block. Here the activations that will drive the muscle models are obtained from experimental EMGs. A nonlinear filter is used for this purpose. Next, we have the MTU kinematics block, in which we use OpenSim to obtain the MTU length and moment arms of all modeled muscles using the motion capture data and the angle data measured by the dynamometer. The MTU length and the activations obtained in the 2 previous blocks are fed into a standard hill-type muscle model to compute muscle force. Afterwards, in the joint dynamics block, muscle forces are projected into the joint space via the moment arms. There are some parameters in the muscle model that need to be calibrated to meet subject-specific needs, namely optimal fiber length, tendon slack length, a strength coefficient to scale the maximum isometric force, and 3 coefficients that define the nonlinear muscle activation mapping. An optimization routine adjusts these parameters until the error between the measured and the estimated torques is minimized. The EMG-driven modeling pipeline described in the previous slides provides us with all the variables needed to compute muscle and joint stiffness. As I said earlier in this presentation, a bottom-up approach is followed, meaning that to obtain joint stiffness, we first need to compute muscle-tendon unit stiffness, which is the series arrangement of the tendon stiffness and the equivalent stiffness of the muscle fiber along the direction of the tendon's line of action. Here is where we modified our model to take pennation angle into account. The original MTU stiffness model, let's call it Model B, did not account for the pennation angle when computing the muscle fiber's equivalent stiffness along the tendon's line of action. Please note that in this diagram we are looking at the stiffness domain, because in the force domain, the standard hill-type muscle model already includes the pennation angle for the muscle force projection, but the pennation angle has not been included when computing stiffness. When we do include it in the model, we obtain what we called Model A, and the equation of the equivalent stiffness gains a few terms to account for the pennation angle. Here we show how the pennation angle of the tibialis anterior and the soleus, a dorsiflexor and a plantar flexor respectively, changed across the cycle of plantar dorsiflexion. In the bottom plot, you can see the joint angle across the cycle. This ranges from approximately -7.5 to 7.5 degrees. The model computes the instantaneous pennation angle from an initial pennation angle at optimal fiber length, a value obtained from cadavers, and the current fiber length. Please note that the assumption that has been made here is that the width of the muscle is constant. In this way, we obtained a rather large pennation angle of approximately 35 degrees for the soleus, and a rather low value of 5 degrees for the tibialis anterior. These 2 muscles will be useful to assess how models A and B behave with MTUs with different architectures. In this plot, we see how models A and B compare when estimating MTU stiffness of muscles with a large pennation angle, such as the soleus, and a small pennation angle, such as the tibialis anterior. We computed the normalized root mean square error between both models to quantify the differences and obtain the values displayed on the slide. Please note how the difference is remarkably lower for the muscle with a smaller pennation angle, mainly because models A and B are identical when the pennation angle is 0. We then moved to the joint level and looked at the average stiffness across all subjects. Here we see the difference between both models. It is remarkable that the largest discrepancy is obtained in the proximity of the plantar flexion peak of the task, mainly because the plantar flexors have a larger pennation angle than the dorsiflexors. We then compared our model-based stiffness estimations with those obtained via a multi-segment ensemble-based system identification method, displayed in red. The table on the slide summarizes the R-squared and the root mean square error values of both models with respect to the system identification estimations. Our new model slightly improved the overall stiffness estimation. This work shows the preliminary results of a muscle model that seamlessly adjusts MTU stiffness according to the pennation angle. Future work should investigate if our new model makes the stiffness formulation more generalizable in more complex tasks, such as locomotion when compared to the previous formulation. Are we able to define a single model that covers all possible muscle architectures and contraction conditions? If so, we will have obtained a model-based approach to decode stiffness from EMG signals and kinematics that does not require joint perturbation. This will enable the creation of predictive simulations optimized from a stability perspective using joint stiffness as parameter to be optimized. This will open up new avenues for joint stiffness estimation methods that are clinically viable in patient populations that might not be able to perform motor tasks under the action of external perturbations. Finally, these model-based estimations of joint stiffness can be used for direct control of bionic limbs and assistive devices and to improve neurorehabilitation therapies. Before I finish, I would like to thank my supervisory team and the funder of the project. Thank you very much for your attention.